welcome to the Peak Endurance Podcast. My name is Isabel Ross and I'm the coach at Peak Endurance Coaching. Episode 53 is an interview with Ricardo Costa. Dr. Ricardo Costa works in the Department of Nutrition, Dietetics and Food, Faculty of Medicine, Nursing and Health Sciences at Monash University as an academic, researcher, consultant and practitioner in sports dietetics and extreme physiology. Ricardo is an HCPC registered dietitian in the UK, a senior registered sport dietitian UK, accredited practicing physician dietitian, Australia, and advanced sports dietitian Australia, who came to Monash University in August 2013 from Coventry University in the UK. Ricardo completed his PhD at the University of Wales in neuroendocrine and nutritional immunology on the influence of sleep deprivation, cold exposure, exercise stress, and nutritional intervention on selected immune responses, all things which seem to happen during ultras. So it is interesting to see that it does affect the immune system. And that research examined the impact of individual and combined stresses on immune function. Additionally, the role of nutrition intervention in the effect of exercise on immune function. Ricardo's recent work has focused on the impact of multi-stressor activity on immune, thermoregulatory and gastrointestinal health, and additionally, the impact of ultramarathon competition on nutrition and hydration status and implications for health. So obviously, what Dr. Ricardo studies is very relevant to us in our running. Ricardo's research interests include the impact of exercise stress with and without other stresses on gut health and the role of nutrition under stress on gut health. Over the last few years, he's established and led an international multi-centre research team investigating the impact of ultra-endurance competition on nutritional and hydration status and on various physiological and immunological parameters in which issues of gut health have been identified. Previously, as course director for sports dietetic training in the UK, he was an active consultant and supervisor in sports dietetics, providing and supervising sport and exercise nutritional support to a wide range of sports at recreational, amateur and elite Olympic level athletes. Are injuries or niggles ruining your enjoyment of running and hindering your performance? Get on top of them so that you can get back to the simple joy that should be running, and it is. Come in and see the specialists at Health and High Performance, where they utilise the latest in technology and experience to help you get back to your running best. So that you can get back to achieving the results you want and are capable of, head to www.healthhp.com.au/run or find them on Instagram under Health High Performance. Anyway, I really hope you enjoy this interview that I did with Dr. Costa. He was so interesting and I learned so much, and I really hope that you do too. Hi, Ricardo, and welcome to the Peak Endurance Podcast.
No, thank you very much for inviting me.
Now, can you tell my listeners a bit more about yourself and how you became interested in sports dietetics and extreme physiology?
Yep. So my background is during high school, I was already on the world triathlon circuit back in the 90s. So I started as a professional athlete from 1993 to 2003. And during that time, of course, nutrition was always a very important part. You know, what can I eat to, keep me going and, keep me earning my income, because having your sponsors and winning races and getting the prize money is what pretty much sustains your life. And, if you can't keep up that, then you're going to have to retire. So what could I do? And the interest was going into nutrition. And as my body couldn't keep up with the younger folk coming through, and I started to go into retirement age at 30s, then I went into academia. And it was just by chance. I went into sport and exercise science, and then from there went into nutrition, and then from there went into dietetics, and then from there into sports dietetics. My PhD was with the UK military, and it was focusing on exercise immunology. Because one of the big problems with special ops and recruitment training in the military was illness and infection. So they wanted to find out, what was the main cause. So my PhD was breaking all the stresses down. So sleep deprivation, food restriction, exercise stress, cold and heat, breaking them down individually and combined to see which is the most immunosuppressive and causing the most problems. And that led into the ultra endurance scene, because with military, a lot of the activities is ultra endurance.
Yeah.
one thing that did come up was gastrointestinal symptoms. And then my postdoc was focusing on nutrition and hydration status of ultra endurance runners, because back in the late 2010s, early 2010s, there wasn't that much research out there. So we did some exploratory work looking at just the feeding and drinking habits of ultra endurance racers over a 24-hour race and over a multi-stage. And the main thing that come out is nearly all the runners are complaining of gastrointestinal symptoms. And then I went into the literature to find, okay, so, how can we prevent some of these? And actually, when I went to literature, everyone's exploring it and saying, yes, athletes are having gastrointestinal symptoms, but no one's doing anything about it. So there wasn't any prevention management strategy in place. And so that's how we got into it, more as a translational research, trying to help the athletes that we work with.
And to be honest,
that's a snapshot of me.
Yeah. To be honest, I still speak with many athletes who still experience a lot of GI distress during racing.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's still a big problem. Definitely.
So what can athletes do to decrease GI distress during racing? I know for myself, I find drinking more water helps, but is there more to it than that?
Oh, absolutely. How much time do we have? Trying to break this down as, as simplistic as possible is what we found out with, almost 10 years of research we've done is there's not one thing that stands out. Every athlete is completely individual, and the causal factors of their symptoms, it could be, a wide array. If, as you just said, it could be a hydration status in your case. In another person's case, it could be just the exercise itself is causing intestinal injury. On another person, it could be the bacterial leakage going to circulation causing vomiting, nausea. There's just no right or wrong. But I can say that it all stems down to three main features. So there are three main features, and one is blood flow moving away from the gut when we exercise. So it means the gut's compromised, its actual activity and structure is compromised. So if you're trying to eat and drink on a compromised gut, well, there's a problem already there. Another one is the stress response of exercise. So simply just exercising and that sympathetic drive, increasing cortisol, adrenaline, glucagon, all those catabolic hormones that start breaking down fuel for you to use, that itself shuts down the gut as well. So if you're trying to drink and eat on a gut which function is reduced, of course you're going to have problems. And then there's another one which is very common in runners. So it's the third one. It's out on the extremities. It may or may not cause problem. That's what we call mechanical strain. And that is just multiple vibrations or impacts on the gut. So if you're running for, say, you're doing an ultra trail run, you're running for 6 hours, or even an Ironman, you're on a bike for 4 hours and then you're going to go and run for 3 hours. It's just that vibration on the GI tract. We now have evidence that actually destroys some of the tissue. If you destroy the tissue, then of course the gut's going to be compromised. So
and how long does
it,
just out of interest, how long does it take for that tissue to recover?
Oh, within 24 hours, everything goes back to normal. So all the markers come back to normal. But it just depends. That's overall a general response. But it just depends how much the damage is. So, for example, if there are been athletes that have done, say, Ironman races that have been detected to have colitis, so the actual destruction on the colon wall. And that's been there for a week. So the signs have been there for a week. So it just depends on how much the damage is caused and that individual response to repairing that damage. But generally, within 24 hours, everything gets recovered. We've seen that in the multi-stage ultramarathon races.
So how did you, you said you tested on 24-hour races and multi-stage. How did you go about doing that?
Oh, that's a very big, long project. So I had a team of about 14 people.
Oh, wow.
And of course, we went to the race and we had a portable lab. And, we set up the portable lab to do blood samples, urine samples, saliva samples, and, your standard, physiological measures. And we just did that before the stage, after the stage in the multi-stage events. And then in the 24 hours, we did it sort of every 6 hours. And in the 24 hours, it's normally a circuit.
Yeah, I've done one of them.
So it's easy. Yeah. The athletes always, they come back to the same point. So it's easier to do that. But in long story short, you just take...
Sorry, go on, yeah.
I was just going to say, you take a mobile lab.
Yeah. So, but would it get progressively more difficult, getting urine and saliva samples as they get tighter and more dehydrated throughout the time?
Yes, of course. Yep. So saliva and urine samples, yes. And that's especially with dehydration. Blood samples are fine. So the blood will always be there. So we can grab that. But that's not a problem, because the blood samples are the ones that are more valid and reliable in terms of the biomarkers. So if we can, we always go for blood sampling.
And so we recommend ultra runners to practice their nutrition, right, in a training scenario, and they, and myself included, I've practiced stuff, it works great. Then it comes to race day, halfway through the race, I'm sick and I can't consume my race nutrition. What is so different about racing to training that happens?
Mm-hmm. So in racing, if you like it or not, you'll always be at a higher exercise intensity than you would in training. Because in training, you can stop if you're not feeling well. There's other factors associated. So it's always a higher stress scenario with a competition. At the same time, just the anxiety and nerves of the competition itself, that's increases sympathetic drive. So that's just another factor on top of shutting down the gut. So it is two scenarios where the stress is greater in the competition sense, and it's just the stress per se shuts down the function of the gut. When I mean function of the gut, it actually shuts down gastric emptying, digestive properties of the accessory organs, and and absorption at the intestinal level. So the actual transporters of carbohydrate are downregulated, so they sort of shut down. So things are more likely to be malabsorbed. So not going to the blood, stay along the gut, and that will give you gut problems as well. Yeah.
And what about, say, for instance, at one race, I use a specific nutrition and it works really well. So I think, okay, I'll use it at the next race. The next race, it doesn't work. Any answers for that one?
Absolutely. It's and this is okay. Remember, I talked about we've got the three main causal factors. Okay. So they're the ones that create the gastro symptoms in the first place. The blood flow, the sympathetic drive, and or the mechanical strain. Then under that, we've got another layer of factors which can create symptoms. And this is what we call exacerbation factors. An exacerbation, and there's two categories. You got extrinsic factors and intrinsic factors. So I'll quickly explain these. Extrinsic factors are exercise intensity, duration. So the longer you go for, the worse it is. The higher intensity, the worse it is. Environmental conditions. So the hotter it is, the worse it is. Altitude. The more you get to altitude, the worse it is. Circadian variation. So we now have data from the lab, a paper is currently being reviewed at the moment, that at night, so if you're racing at night, the shutdown of the gut is more than the day. And the mechanism for that is a higher cortisol response. So if you're doing a trail race at night versus day, you could be consuming the same thing, but the scenarios are different, and you've got a shutdown gut versus a competent gut in the day versus night. And hydration status. So in one scenario, you'll probably think you're hydrated when you start, but on the other one, you might be starting in a mild hypohydrated state. So they're your extrinsic factors, and then we've got the intrinsic factors. Intrinsic is within the body, so that is biological sex. So we do see differences between males and females, and that's due to the hormonal status. And we do now have evidence in terms of the menstrual cycle. During certain periods, symptoms are more prone than the others. The predisposition. So if you have a family history of gastrointestinal inflammatory or functional disorders, So Crohn's disease, celiac disease, irritable bowel syndrome, you're more likely, and there's probability of greater symptoms than if you don't have family history of that. We now have data from a recent study just been published now, the gut microbiome, so the bacterial composition in your gut can accelerate or decelerate the symptoms that you get, and the paper gives you a breakdown of the different bacteria which can prompt it or reduce it. And then intrinsically, of course, the hydration status fits that as well. Mm. So yeah, it's a quite a complex system. So it's not in one. So if, for example, you're saying you're consuming the same foods, but in one scenario you did well, and the other one not. So in one situation, it could be just the time of day effect, but in the other scenario, it could just be your hydration status where you started was slightly different. But even though the food's all the same, so the intrinsic, extrinsic factors could be altering whether you get symptoms or not to the same food.
Yeah. Yeah. And what can we do? Like many ultra races, start in the morning and then go all day and go all night. What should we do to sort of get around that effect of the cortisol at night? Because we obviously still need to keep eating.
Yeah. So what we suggest, and we're testing this at the moment, so this is all anecdotal, and we've just had comments, is training your gut at night. So if you train it, we normally recommend people train your gut in the day to help accelerate the gastric function, absorption of those nutrients to the day exercise. But if you're racing at night, it's very important that you do the night training. But it's not just one off. What we found is that you need at least 2 weeks of repetitive training the gut to actually have the adaptive effect. So a minimum of 2 weeks, and within those 2 weeks, a minimum of 3 times a week of actually going out for a 2 or 3 hour run. And actually, we do not recommend for gut training to do your race nutrition. What we recommend is do 120% of your race nutrition.
Oh, wow.
So do more than what you would do in a race, because you need to overstress an organ. I know it's hard. It's training.
Yeah.
You need to overstress your organ to then it be easier during the race.
See, I probably do less.
Possibly. Yeah. So if you don't do this, you're not gut training. All you're doing is practicing the behavior of the nutritional intake. You're not really stressing the gut and getting it to adapt to that overburden. Yeah,
and that's a fair point. Yeah, I shall have to up my game. All right, and so we've talked about hydration. What is an optimal hydration for an athlete? Like just generally day to day.
Well, I can't answer that. It just depends on what your losses are, and I mean. It's so hard, and also without laboratory methods, we've got to the state where unless you're doing blood sampling, bioelectric impedance, and doing multiple movements of hydration, can we actually accurately say you are in a euhydrated, hypo, or hyper state? So it's very difficult. But I mean the easiest way, and what the literature is stating now, is using a combination of methods. So using your thirst response, using changes in body weight, resting, so wake up body weight, and urine measure of hydration, just urine color and urine frequency.
Yeah.
So in other words, if you're not thirsty, it's probably there is sufficient body water in the blood to control that thirst. And unlike popular belief in the past, that thirst is not a good mechanism of dehydration, and when you're thirsty, you're ready to do it. That is such a lie. That is such a myth.
Oh, that's good to know.
The thirst mechanism kicks in when your plasma osmolality sort of hits 295 milliosmoles per kilogram, and that is still within euhydration. In other words, when you start to get thirsty, you are still hydrated. So it doesn't mean you're too late. That's not correct to say that. So if you're not thirsty, you're fine. If you're going to the toilet frequently and giving good volume, and if color's reasonably clear, you're fine. And then if your body weight doesn't change on on a day-to-day basis when you wake up, then you're fine as well. But if you notice that you're thirsty, you're not going to toilet as much, and when you do, your color is you're dark. And then when you wake up in the morning, you notice you've got a couple of 100 grams underweight consistently. Yeah. Using those three indications probably says that you probably need to increase your water intake. But whether you are specifically dehydrated or overhydrated, we can't say unless we have laboratory tests to confirm
that's
that.
fair enough.
But those
Can you train yourself to need less hydration when you're racing? Is that possible? Because I know some people try that.
No, you can't do that. It's just all about tolerance. I mean, some of the elite runners can lose, 6 to 8% body weight, but it just, their physiology can cope with that. Whether that's a training effect or genetic effect, we don't know. But or whether if they were able to be hydrated a bit more, they'd go faster. We don't know. That's that argument as well. They do lose 6% and they negative split, but what about if they were able to maintain their hydration? Would they go faster? There is no training mechanism to enhance your performance with dehydration. We notice with dehydration, all the physiological markers just go crazy. So ideally, for optimal performance, you want to maintain your hydration. But it does not mean that you need to replace everything you lose. With exercise, you'll always lose a bit. Yeah. And as you're within the 2 to 3% body mass loss, you're fine.
Yeah, no, that's good. What about the idea of fasted runs and becoming fat adapted through using fasted runs?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I'm sure there's a lot of people out there. Now, how to approach this question?
Yes, it can be a bit of a rabbit hole, this one.
Well, I'll first answer by saying that you wake up in the morning, and depending on what you've eaten the days before, will reflect your muscle glycogen content. So your muscle glycogen content will not deplete with sleeping. Once it's in the muscle, it can only come out with muscle contraction, for energy production. So you're waking up with low blood sugar levels or low blood glucose levels because your liver glycogen, which regulates your blood sugar levels overnight, is depleted. So you're exercising with a depleted liver glycogen store, not with a muscle glycogen store. Now, whether you use fats or carbohydrates as a fuel is also dependent on your muscle glycogen stores. So if you wake up even with 50% or 40% muscle glycogen stores and you start training, I'm sorry, but you're going to be using muscle glycogen as a primary fuel for that exercise session. Yeah. All you're doing is you've depleted your liver glycogen, which regulates blood sugar levels. So this is why it's difficult to answer the question is, if you, for say the day before, have done a high intensity interval session, which has depleted your muscle glycogen stores, and then you haven't consumed any carbohydrates after that session and have just consumed fats and proteins, so you haven't replenished that muscle glycogen, and then you've gone to sleep, and then you've woken up the next morning, then your muscle glycogens are depleted, and then when you start exercising, then of course you're going to use fat as a fuel because there's just no carbohydrates in the muscle. So it just depends. The fuel used in the muscle depends what you've done a couple of days before, the day before, in terms of intake and training status.
Yeah. No, that sounds. Go on.
No, I was just going to say, but what we know now from the literature is in order to enhance your fat oxidation, you don't really need to do any of these, crazy oscillating diets. If you're training, no, but it's quite basic to understand is that if you're, and a lot of elite endurance athletes do not do these crazy diets and absolutely just hammer in their races, and they have massively high fat oxidation rates. And the reason for that is that their training load, when they do their long training sessions, say for example, a cyclist could go out for 8-hour bike ride, an Ironman triathlete can do a 2 to 3 hour bike ride and then do a brick and go straight into a 1 hour run. That's a 4 hour session or a 6 hour session. Your muscle glycogen content will only cover you for about 2 hours. before it becomes depleted, even in a moderate exercise state. And we see that in our labs when we look at oxidation rates in our athletes in lab. After 2 hours, we see the crossover. Carbs goes down and fats go up, irrespective if we're feeding them, 90 grams an hour carb every hour. You get the
so
switch
even if they're
because it's
feeding
in the muscle.
Yep.
Completely. Okay. I can send you the papers that show this, that we're feeding 90 grams of sugar an hour, and at the end of 3 hours, carbohydrate oxidation drops and fat oxidation goes up, and blood sugar levels up around 6-8 millimolar, meaning they're hyperglycemic. They're hyperglycemic, so the blood sugar levels are high.
Wow.
Because it's the muscle dictates what's happening in the muscle will dictate what fuel is going to be used, not what's in the blood. And it takes time for what's in the blood to get into the muscle.
Yeah, of course.
So going back to my point, you've got, 6-hour session for a cyclist, 4-hour session for an Ironman. After 2 hours, you're depleted. So you're training 2 hours in depleted state anyway.
Yeah.
For the triathlete. And that cyclist will be training for 4 hours in a depleted state. So those adaptations will occur naturally when you do your long sessions.
That's so good. Yeah, it's so good that we don't have to obsess about all that sort of stuff then.
No, not at all. And we're about to send a paper off this week with all that data to show that we've got, about 20 highly trained ultramarathon runners and Ironmans that just using a normal high carbohydrate diet, and their fat oxidation rates when we get to the depleted state are 1.2 to 1.7 grams per minute. So it means they're excessively high fat burners irrespective of their diet. And the correlation there is, it's because their training volumes are so great. They will be in that fat burning zone anyway, just because of their training.
That's so good because carbs are nice to eat.
Yeah.
And what are your thoughts
so
on?
You can.
Yes, yay. And what are your thoughts on engineered food versus real food when racing? And certainly for ultramarathons where we're at a slower pace, I guess, than say a marathon.
Can you give me some examples? So I'm a real food. I'm assuming, say, fruit puree.
Yeah, or maybe a sandwich,
or a banana, or a mango.
Yep. I'll have a sandwich, or people like soup or noodles. Yep. Especially during the night, you might have something hot like soup or noodles.
Yep.
Because if you're out for a really long time, it's nice to have something that feels like food. But I know there are certain athletes who will do 100 miles just on gels. And I'm just wondering, what your thoughts are on that.
Well, again, there's no right or wrong, but when the longer you go for, what we start to see something called taste fatigue and flavor fatigue. So the longer, for marathon run or Olympic course triathlon, all those are fine. But as soon as you start going to the ultra, you need to start mixing around flavors, tastes, and textures. Because if you just stick to one thing, flavor fatigue will kick in, and that will bring on symptoms on its own because of that taste and flavor fatigue. And also there's a behavior element that the athlete will try to avoid that foods because they just get sick of it. So, so it's important to get, as you said, to get that mixture in. Whether it causes symptoms or not, then that's where the gut training comes in. You need to train what you're going to use in the race in your training. There is a degree. So liquids create less gastric burden. Semi-solids are in the middle, and then solids create the biggest burden. But it doesn't mean it's going to cause symptoms. If you train in those solid foods, then your gut will be adapted to use those in the race. So it's highly recommended. The athletes that we work with, they come to us. So the question we ask is, what do you normally eat? What would you like? What are your favorite tastes and flavors? And then we mix it over, a 24-hour or a 5-day multi-stage ultramarathon, etc. And another thing that I'll probably can throw in there is we've noticed that as the race prolongs, the necessity or not the necessity, the feeling of salty food starts to kick in.
Yes. Yeah.
So we also seen that normally we'd would recommend sweet stuff in the beginning, but then translate into more starchy and salty foods towards the end. And that is this is not necessarily in terms of physiological need, it is more a sensory and behavioral and perceptive need.
Yep, I have noticed that myself. So, yeah, that's fair enough. What about, like, people talk about after a session or, a hard training session, there's an optimal window for eating food. Is that an old wives' tale, or is that true?
Oh, no, that's very true. Yes. And then I can tell you what it is. Yeah. So when we look at recovery nutrition, so you're talking about recovery nutrition?
Yeah, basically.
Yes.
Yep.
So again, what we've found recently with recovery nutrition is starting to get a bit more starting to get slightly more complicated now. With carbohydrates replenishment, ideally it's immediately after, but you've got within the first hour. So ideally immediately after, you got the first hour. With protein intake, so to help with muscle protein synthesis, recovery, repair, growth, training, adaptations. Similar, the best is immediately after, but you've got that hour window.
Yep.
With rehydration, you've got up to 2 hours, because you don't want to be shoving in the fluids immediately because of correct diuresis. So you want to, instead it'll just go in and you'll pee it out. It won't retain.
Yeah.
So you'd want to sip on it over the 2 hour period. And you've got the carbs and proteins in there as well. And they are the most potent osmotic nutrients that we have, not electrolytes. And we've seen this clearly in our research data. Everyone's obsessed with electrolytes, but we now, like, for example, in our recent test, we gave, a high sodium electrolyte beverage, and then we just gave, a carb protein beverage with very little sodium. And it was the carbon and protein beverage that was able to retain water nearly 50% more than the sodium, which half of it was peed out. So the carbs and proteins will help retain that water. So if you want to help with rehydration, the nutrients need to be there as well. For immune function, so for immune competency, which you need not just for illness, infection prevention, and you got the open window of potential exposure. It has to be immediately. I mean, immediately, as soon as you finish, or even during the cool down period, consume something then, because we've noticed if we leave it for an hour period, you still get that depressive drop and it stays down for 6 hours. But if you give it immediately after, it plateaus it, and depending on what you eat, you could get an immune boost. So that one needs to be immediately. And then there's the fifth element of recovery, which is the GI tract. As I mentioned, the GI tract is compromised. And this is where it gets tricky, is because you're trying to give things immediately after. But we've noticed that if you give things immediately after versus an hour, there's more malabsorption. So not all of it's going through. And there's more GI symptoms because the transporters are shut down and they haven't kicked in yet. So I guess the best of both worlds, we haven't tested this yet, but the best of both worlds will be to have your carb, protein, or the meal, beverage, whatever it is, start immediately after, and small and sweet for sort of the first hour. So it won't be a big, massive intestinal load. It'll be smaller amounts to give time for the GI tract to kick in, but at least you're already starting to put some in there to help that immune maintenance. Does that all make sense? Or
no, that was great. And
over the place?
It's really interesting about the immune response, because I've certainly found, like, after a big race, I don't feel like eating, but I always get sick afterwards. So that really clears that one up.
Yep. Cool.
And is there like a best ratio of carbs to protein, or it just doesn't matter?
Well, the standard recommendations we give that has helped with all these recovery markers is 1.2 grams of carbs per kilogram body mass. In a relatively lean athlete. So of course, if someone is overweight or have got excess body fat, of course, there could be overestimating these values. So 1.2 grams of carbs, 0.4 grams of protein. So a 3-to-1 ratio.
Yep, yep. Okay.
And the reason for that is that the protein uptake by tissues is very slow. So there's no point giving more. You're going to be peeing it out.
Wasting
so it's
it.
actually better giving, small doses every 2 hours instead of, one big dose at once. Whereas carbohydrates, you can give as much as you want. It'll just go into store until it's filled up.
Yep. And are there any supplements or anything like that nutritionally can help athletes, or can they get everything from their food?
Well, from a dietetic perspective, we have 3 stages of nutritional support. So sport nutritional support. When we do an assessment on athletes, we look at their energy expenditure and nutrient expenditure for their training status. And in most cases, you can get everything from food, If you're training, up to 2 to 4 hours a day, easy to get things from food, because there are ways to fortify foods to increase carb, protein, micronutrients. An example I can give, this is just a basic example. If you can increase the carb content of, say, a smoothie, just whack in 1 or 2 heaped tablespoons of skim milk powder, and there you've got your carb protein dose increase there. So that's just one example. Then, if their nutritional needs can't be met via food, example, they do 6 hours of training a day, that means there's more time training and less time able to prepare food, because that's the problem, more in terms of food preparation and time. And also consumption. If you're having big bulky meals that you need to eat, you just don't feel hungry and it's just too much to eat. Then we fortify fluids. So juices, smoothies, milks, everything, you put normal food substances into those. And then there's a third element, is only if you can't meet your nutritional requirements via food fortification, then we give supplements. And the supplement would be, proteins, carbohydrates, and or vitamin mineral supplementation. But we're looking at athletes that are, training 6 hours or more at that stage. So if you're not training 6 hours or more, you don't really need additional supplementation. You can do everything from food. And if you're not doing everything from food, it just means you don't know how to do it. Yeah. Basically.
Yeah. That's fair enough. Now, I had one of my listeners ask a question, because I interviewed an athlete who had rhabdomyosarcoma. I can't say it, rhabdo.
Yes.
And this listener wanted to know, what effect can nutrition have on preventing rhabdo?
Right. Oh, geez. I can't answer that one, because I need to know what the background history of that athlete was.
Say for we're talking just general athletes. Can athletes do anything generally with their food to avoid it?
Oh, not necessarily, because it's got to do more with the training status and the actual stress response of the actual competition. They've pushed it too hard, too long, and they I guess didn't mitigate any of those issues during the competition, because technically they shouldn't get any rhabdomyolysis unless they might have some medical condition. Yeah. If they do get that, it just means they've pushed it too hard, too much, too long, and then that would be a warrant for medical support. But from a nutritional perspective, there's nothing we can really do. Just meet your nutritional needs for your training and competition. If you're going to competition and you're not meeting your energy requirements, so low energy availability, there's a risk factor there. And excessive training without proper recovery, where the muscle tissue is already in a sort of pre-damaged state. But that's the preparation phase leading up. Not really not much you can do for the actual competition.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough. No worries. Also, there's talk about, periodizing nutrition. Should athletes periodize their nutrition according to what they're doing day to day, or for different cycles of training?
Sorry, I missed that. I missed that, Isabel.
Yep. Should athletes periodize their nutrition, like on a day-to-day basis, and also on a training cycle basis?
Yes, absolutely. That's the way forward for sport and exercise nutrition. It is dietary periodization. based on what you're about to do and what is the aim and objective of that session. So like, for example, if you're doing a high intensity interval session where you're going to be working at your, say, your lactate threshold to try and push your anaerobic threshold up, of course, to do those sessions, you need to be carbo loaded. You need to have that quick energy full to get to those exercise intensities. But the next morning, if you're going to do a long ride that you want to enhance fat oxidation, well, then at the end of that session, provide your recovery nutrition in terms of providing the protein, small amounts of.
Oh, hang on, I've lost you.
But try and avoid the carbohydrates going into that session in the morning. Yeah. And then when you wake up, you do have a normal breakfast and you do have carbohydrates in order to provide the body with some blood glucose, so you don't do your session in a hypoglycemic state, because it'll just be horrid. Yes, and that has no impact. Oh God. And that will have no impact whatsoever of oxidation in the muscle, because it won't, it'll just be hanging around in the blood. It will take a very long time to get through. So it's more just for you to feel okay to start the session and do the session. And then, you do your session, but then imagine that afternoon or the next morning, you've got another high intensity session. Then of course, then you're going to start to increase the carb concentration before that next high interval session. So your diet is always changing. You apply based on what you're going to be doing next.
Yeah. And should you I've heard that you should maybe eat less on an easy day as compared to on a day with more training. Is that correct as well?
Of course, if you're having a rest day or light day, there's no point in stacking up on a whole heap of nutrients, unless you're doing your preparation nutrition and you've got an interval session the next day.
Yeah.
So, but that means you can have a light breakfast, you can have a light lunch, but then after lunch, when you have your afternoon snack and evening meal or supper, make sure you consume higher amounts so that will fill up your muscle glycogen stores for the next morning if you do your interval session. But normally interval sessions will be done in the afternoon, not necessarily in the morning.
That's fair enough. Yeah. Is there anything else that you think ultra endurance athletes should know about nutrition and that sort of thing?
Well, going back to the gut, as I said before, it's very individualized, and it's very difficult to answer. Like, a lot of athletes come to me and say, how do I, and even yourself has asked me the question, and how do I stop gastrointestinal symptoms? Well, I don't, because I need to assess you first. So the best thing to do is you need to do a gut assessment. So actually challenge your gut during exercise in a simulated setting in the environmental conditions you're going to be racing in where the symptoms occur. And then from there, you can identify what that individual's causal factors and exacerbatory effect, and then you can put an action plan in place. Yeah. So if it is because of dehydration, you got to drink some more fluids. If we've had this case, the sweat response is so great that athlete can't even drink enough fluids to meet the sweat response to stop dehydration. Well, then it means you need to challenge your gut with extra fluids to try and enhance fluid uptake. If it's because of the heat, you're not adapted to the heat, well, then need to come up with strategies for external, internal cooling to keep the body temperature down so you don't get symptoms. If it's because of FODMAPs and you didn't realize, so we'll identify that in the test, then we need to change the high FODMAP to a low FODMAP food. Yeah. So there's multiple ways of reducing symptoms, but it just pretty much depends on what is causing the problems, and you need to identify that through an assessment.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's fair enough. And another question, can you preload with water to sort of pre-hydrate before a race?
Yes, you can. Yeah, and there's multiple strategies you can use. So sodium citrate, sodium chloride, glycerol. There's multiple ways you can. The question is do you want to, and is it going to be of benefit for you? So if the race is in the heat, there's really. So do you want me to give you the two scenarios?
Yep.
So if your racing is in thermoneutral conditions, like 20 degrees, there's really no need for it. Because you'll be able to maintain your hydration during the race, and the heat stress is not going to be a problem. But if you're training in hot conditions, then yes, you probably do want to start with a slightly higher plasma volume or a higher body water content, just to help with thermoregulation. However, just the natural adaptations of being in the heat, so heat acclimation and heat adaptations will increase your plasma volume, 1 to 2 liters. So there's really no need to do sodium citrate, sodium chloride or glycerol protocols in order to increase plasma volume, because just at a normal presence of being in the heat will start to cause that. So yes, you can do it, but in reality, do you need to do it? In most cases you don't, because your body will adapt to the environment it's in.
Yeah, so the body's pretty smart, really, I guess. So.
Yeah, and also actually, Isabella, I'll mention that if we're talking to ultra endurance runners, or absolutely not, do not be fluid overloading the body, because our biggest problem is hyponatremia and exercise hyponatremia, and your training, your heat acclimation, all that will increase plasma volume. So just those long endurance sessions, we've seen that ultra endurance plasma volume is greater expanded than with your Olympic course or your short distance and marathon runners, simply because they're training for longer periods of time at low intensity. The body's adapted to that. So do not be doing any of these adaptations, because you're just going to cause yourself more problems.
Yeah, that's good to know. Now, how can my listeners find out more about getting the testing done?
Well, either you can contact us at Monash University. So Monash University, we do run a clinic there, but I've already trained other sports dietitians and exercise physiologists on how to do these gut assessment challenges. So it'll just be contacting your local exercise physiology clinic or sports dietitian to see if they have any resources to do the testing.
Okay, that's good to know. And I'll put the Monash University details in the show notes. And thank you very much for sharing all of your knowledge.
No, thanks very much, Isabella, for inviting me. Always happy to help the fellow ultra runners and fellow athletes. Absolutely.
That's great. Thanks so much. And I'm sure my listeners will have got a lot out of it. So thank you very much.
Cool. Thank you. Thanks.
Bye.
I'll see you later.
Bye.